Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope I hope you have enjoyed the first morning session. Now we're heading to the second presentation, and this one is from Miriam Sester Retorta. Professor Miriam holds a bachelor degree in the English language and literatures from the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo, licensed teacher degree from the same university, and a master's degree in English language studies from the Federal University of Paraná, a doctorate degree in applied linguistics from the State University of Campinas, and a postdoctorate in applied linguistics from the State University of Londrina. She works at the Academy Department of Modern Languages and at the Federal University of Technology, Paraná. She currently conducts research in the group Technology, Teacher Education and Literacies. She coordinates projects entitled Mobile, Digital and Multiliteracies to Visually Impaired Students, and she also concentrates studies on assessment literacy, academic literacies, mobile literacies, and multiliteracies. Everybody, please welcome Miriam Sester Retorta for the presentation titled The Challenges of Inclusive Assessment Practices. Miriam?
Thank you very much for having invited. I want to thank all the organizers of the event for having invited me. It's an honor to be here this morning with you all. Thank you very much. It was really nice listening to Judith. I identified with Judith very much, and I think we're going to have lots in common to talk about here. Thank you very much. My talk today is the challenges of inclusive assessment practices, and my talk will be divided into a brief history of disability and inclusion, very brief history, some legislation on inclusion, the concepts of integration and inclusion, who is responsible for inclusion, effective evaluative practices, and problems we face today in terms of evaluation. Okay. So when I talk about the history of disability, we divide it into 4 periods, although there's no clear cut between the boundaries of these periods, because some concepts that you find in the pre-Christian period still exist today, depending on the country, depending on the culture you're in. So it's just for a didactic purpose, right? So we have the pre-Christian period, the Christian period, the rehabilitation period, and acceptance period. Ever since mankind, and ever since man was man, ever since the beginning of mankind to this period, people with disability were neglected and mistreated. They were treated as possessed by the evil, seared, or as helpless creatures punished by God. Oops. The history of treatment and attitude toward people with disabilities have often been marked by social fears, intolerance, ambivalence, prejudice, and ignorance regarding disability. Right. Throughout ages, people with disability have been subjected to infanticide, starved, burned, shunned and isolated, strangled, submerged into hot water, beaten, chained, caged, tortured, gassed, shot, sterilized, warehoused and sedated, hanged and used as amusement in circuses. Then there has been a turning point from the Christian period on. So from the Christian period onwards, disabled people started being protected by compassion. They were spared from death most of the time, but they were still treated as incapable, as the poor creatures of God. Although, on the other hand, there were Catholic moralism translated the disabled representative figures as sin and placed them before the fire of Inquisition at times. And from the 17th to the 19th centuries, these people started being institutionalized, right? So institutions were open and they served as deposits of people with disability. There was no objective of treating or taking care of them in the sense of trying to make them integrate into society. It was just another way of not killing them, but segregating them into a different place. Then from the Second World War on, actually from the First War, a period of rehabilitation started. And here, mainly because of the soldiers who came home without their members and with all sorts of disabilities, this period started, and these disabled people were, the disabilities were conceived, diagnosed, and studied as disease. And what was the intention? The intention was to rehabilitate, to integrate into society. So the aim in this period was to restore these people's disabilities, to restore their capacities, their rights, their legal status that had been lost. So if the disabled couldn't walk, they wanted this person to walk. If he couldn't see, they wanted him to see, and so on, right? And the intention, of course, was to make them workers again, productive, participative, and taxpayers, right? Then at the end of the 20th century, the period of acceptance and respect for diversity started. So it's pretty new, more than 30 years, right? 30, 40 years. And it is known that human diversity has been in place since the beginning of humanity, but it was only at the end of the 20th century that people became aware of these specificities, right? Declaring that human beings are not equal. And then it's interesting that for decades, people have fought for equality, but we should be fighting for equity. That is, I'm not like you, I'm not like a 20-year-old lady, I'm not like a man, but I want opportunities, and I want people to respect my strengths and weaknesses, and I want opportunities that respect my person. And that's what we have to fight for, equity and not equality. There are many documents that we can talk about, many, but I've chosen just a few for the purpose of this talk, right? So the first being in 1990, of the World Declaration on Education for All and Framework for Action to Meet Basic Learning Needs in Thailand. In 1994, very, very important, the UNESCO Salamanca Statement, and Brazil is the signatory country of this statement, right? Very, very important. This document was a turning point, I guess, for the whole world. And then in 1999, the Inter-American Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against People with Disability in Guatemala. And in Brazil, we have solid legislation on it, very well-written law of directives and basis for education, Leis Diretrizes e Base, very well-written. There has been amendments to it, but very solid. The National Education Plan, I'm sorry, there's a typo, it's 2014 to 2024. The National Directives for Special Education in Basic Education as well, and many other documents that have been very well conceived, well planned and organized to help inclusion. So should we integrate or include people in society, right? So in the pre-Christian period, people were excluded. Most disabled people were actually killed, right? So you had society here, and they were the outsiders. In the Christian period, they were spared from death, but they were segregated into places, different places, be it mountains or institutions, right? In the rehabilitation period, people with disability had to restore the abilities they had lost in order to integrate into society. So they had to change in order to meet the expectancies of these people from society, and that's integration, right? And inclusion, it's a two-way, right? We neurotypic people, normal neurotypic people, have to understand, have to learn about disabilities and help include them into our society, and vice versa. It's a two-way, right? So we have to know who they are, how they feel, how we can help them be included in our society. In 2014, 12 undergraduate students and I started a project called English for the Visually Impaired. We had 25 visually impaired students from age 10 to 60 in a room. And these neurotypic undergraduate students helped me teach English to these blind students. It was a 4-year extensive project and research project, because out of this experience, we started conducting research to understand how we could help visually impaired people in Brazil learn how to speak English. And we found out that in Brazil, unfortunately, this diagram was one diagram we made for one of our publications. We lack sharing information, like parents and school. Here, parents and disabled kids with school with healthcare, hospitals, clinics, institutions. It should be, all the information should be intermingled here, right? And the university collecting data, understanding, and giving it back to this environment here, right? And of course, always have social workers and police force, because many of disabled children are maltreated by their own families. So we need this part integrating into this ecosystem here, okay? So how should we adapt to inclusive assessment practices, right? Well, first of all, ask. Get to know everything about your student. Our experience with our 25 blind students was very interesting, because they taught us how to teach them. They taught us how to evaluate them. We had to learn, my undergraduate students and I had to learn how to use a screen reader, how to use a cell phone, they taught us how to prepare, how to adapt the material for them. And then we started asking them questions so we could tailor make this course and the evaluative tools for them. For example, how long does it take to read a text in Braille, right? We were surprised that 2/3 of the students did not read Braille. First of all, because usually just 2 of them were blind since birth. All the other ones became blind because of other diseases. So they had comorbidities, right? So like schizophrenic and blind, autistic and blind. They had all sorts of other diseases, especially diabetes, right? That was caused a lot of problems, because people with diabetes, they lose their touch and they can't learn how to read Braille, right? So generally, the average reading speed for Braille is lower than the average speed of reading common print. So that was one thing we found out. And then we asked, how long does it take to write a text in Braille? For a proficient reader and writer, they have a 32-minute per word against an average of 90-minute per word of a sighted proficient typist. So twice as much, right? So it takes a long time for a proficient reader or writer to write in Braille. And then we started learning with our blind students that we had to include screen readers like DOSBox and VDA. And then we found out that the cell phone was the best ever for any visually impaired student in school, especially iPhones that have native Braille system on them, right? Many of these students complained about the national examination, Exame Nacional do Ensino Médio, ENEM. It's the SAT, Brazilian SAT, right? Before 2020, and you're going to see why it's before 2020, visually impaired students were allowed to take their Braille typewriters, their touch plates, their reglets, magnifying glasses. However, most of them asked for readers because they had just 1 extra hour to take the test. And even if you're a proficient Braille reader and writer, it would take longer than an extra hour to take the examination. So they asked for readers who read the text out loud and helped write down the answers on the answer slips, right? And that was a big problem. One of my undergraduate students, Eloisa Patitucci, she did her final extended paper. She conducted a piece of research called The Challenges of ENEM for Candidates with Visual Impairments, Analysis of the English Reading Test and the Writing Portuguese, Produção Escrita. And then what she found out was that the reader, the person who read the text out loud, was not asked for any requirement concerning English proficiency. The person just had to say, oh, I know some English. So imagine what kind of reading this candidate had to listen to, right? So you never know how good a reader this reader is in English. And this reader is asked to repeat parts of the text. Some blind students reported that some readers were nice and repeated as many times as they asked. Others were not, right? And we found out that there is just no construct validity for the English reading test in for visually impaired, because the construct is listening and not reading. Since somebody is reading the text out loud for them, they're being evaluated on listening. And listening and speaking are not taught in public schools in Brazil, right? The English listening and speaking, right? So how can you ask for a blind candidate for a listening test, and this has never been taught in school, and the quality of the listening test and the quality of the reading, right? Concerning the writing, the candidate has to dictate the writing to the reader so he can write the composition for him. And some readers ask the candidates to spell the whole text out loud. So again, there's no construct validity. It's a spelling bee, not a writing, right? It's not fair. So after 2020, let me go back here. After 2018, we wrote a statement and we sent it to INEP, who is responsible for the national examination. And last year, they allowed visually impaired students to use screen reader, which is victory for us. It's still a listening test, right? It's still a listening test. However, the student can set the screen reader for English, so we can guarantee that the English being read is adequate. He can go back as many times as he wants. So it gives the blind candidate autonomy while doing the the English test. Another question, would you ever give a student with hearing impairments a listening test? Sounds strange, doesn't it? But I've seen this happening. And then when I questioned the teacher why she was giving a listening test to a deaf student, she decided not to give him the test, but deduct the grade, the score from the general score, which is not fair either. So when adapting your evaluative instruments for disabled student, I think there are no secrets, there are no right or wrong, and there are no recipes, right? What we've learned from our blind student is you have to learn as much as possible with your student about his or her impairment. And this student will give you a lot of very interesting information. Ask your student how he or she learns. Ask his or her parents as well. Ask experts about the impairment. There are a lot of good experts on Instagram, on Facebook. My youngest kid had a difficulty in the beginning of his life, and the speech therapist and the psychopedagogue would go to school every beginning of the year to talk to my son's teachers to tell them what would be the best way to teach, to evaluate him. Ask your student what are the most suitable ways to teach and evaluate him. Adapt the material, adapt your classroom, adapt the curricula. And with Brazilian legislation, that is totally possible and feasible to adapt anything. You don't have to give a full test to the student. You can give half the test. You can give half the test one day, the other half another day, or just half the test, right? And most importantly, teach and learn with your neurotypic student, with the normal student, how you can help include the disabled classmate. So it's not only the teacher's responsibility. Whose responsibility is it? It's everybody's responsibility to include people at school, in the building you live with, in shops, industries. So the teacher, together with his or her neurotypic students, they have to learn about the disabled student and help this student be included in the classroom. One of the 24 blind students I had previously entered university, and he was my student again as an undergraduate student. And he had to do a speech, and a lot of his classmates were complaining about him because they said that he didn't do his reading, he didn't do what he had to do, because it took much longer. So they didn't understand that he had to go slower. So I asked him to give a speech. I blindfolded all the neurotypic sighted students, and they had to listen to this blind student deliver his speech, all blindfolded. After the presentation, we talked about his talk, but we also talked about how they felt being blindfolded, how they felt about the process. So it's the teacher's obligation, in fact, and the school's obligation to get the neurotypic students involved in including disabled students, right? So I'm going to finish a little bit earlier so we can ask and talk more about these other issues. He who is different from me does not impoverish me, he enriches me. So the more you learn about the disabled, the more information you have in order to make your classroom a more inclusive and fair place to be in. Okay. These are the references. And I want to show you before here. This is the book my undergraduate students wrote, Teaching English to the Visually Impaired. After our 4-year experience, we decided to write an English handbook for English teachers who want to teach blind students, with lots of tips on how to teach blind students. For blind students, we have this English for Us. It's an audio book, right? It accompanies this one here, right? This is for the visually impaired students. And also a book in Portuguese called Avaliação em Línguas Estrangeiras, a Teoria e a Prática, which talks about theory and practices of evaluation, right, in the Portuguese language. I think that's it.
That was a nice presentation, Miriam, and we have some questions in the chat box.
Okay.
All right, let me see.
Kind of nervous, so it doesn't always go the way you would like it to go.
Oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Juliane Silva is saying, dear Professor Retorta, I totally agree with you that we have to include these people to be able to build a healthy and equal society. My concern is with the lack of conditions, be them financial, structural, or educational, teachers are offered in their working spaces. So how do you see, Miriam, the role of the institution, the government, and etc. in this process of giving students with special needs the proper attention and care they need and deserve?
That's an excellent question.
It is.
And I'm going to give two different answers. One, if you come from a wealthy country or a wealthy school, and one if you come from middle lower class school, right? Within these 24 students, 6 of them didn't have a cell phone, and we wanted to teach them using audios with the cell phone. So we had charity parties to gain fund and buy cell phones for these students, right? But ideally, with the school, you know, my school does have screen readers and everything the student needs to help this student learn and be evaluated. But I think that if the teacher involves the sighted students, the neurotypic students, they can help the teacher include in all terms. For example, my undergraduate students prepared all the material. They came up with they came up with masterpieces. Believe such beautiful gadgets and activities they prepared. So the teacher will never have time to take care of all her included students, because in one classroom she's got a blind student, an autistic, Down student at the same time. You know that. We don't have people, we don't have the, what are they called? The auxiliar, né? The person, the tutor.
Teacher assistant.
We don't have assistants or tutors to help. So I think the neurotypic students, the sighted students, have to learn and help teacher include these disabled students. That's at least my vision.
That's interesting. So you propose that we use the rest of the group, the other students in the group, as a resource and means and of including the student with special need.
Exactly. I'll give you an example. We had a Halloween party. My students had never been to a Halloween party. They had no idea what it was. And how can you teach blind people what Halloween party is? So my sighted students prepared all the visual elements, and they prepared the pin the tail on the donkey, a furry donkey. They prepared beautiful things for them. So it helps the sighted people understand disabled. It prevents bullying because they're engaged and involved in helping the other. So it helps in various in various sites, you know.
Yeah. And do you think that this idea also applies to public schools and public environment?
Especially because in public schools, it's the teacher and the teacher, and people think it's only the teacher's responsibility to include. And it's not only the teacher's responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility. It's my responsibility, it's your responsibility, it's the neurotypic student's responsibility to learn how to include. At the university I teach at, they have Libras, which is the Brazilian Sign Language, right? And I was attending a class, and there were 3 boys from the engineering department. And I said, what are you doing here? And they says, well, we do internship in an industry, and there are plenty of deaf boys there, and we would like to talk to them. So they were learning Brazilian Sign Languages with us so they could interact with the boys at the industry. Isn't that cute? So that's what should be done everywhere, everywhere. Shops, industries, church, school, everybody should be learning how to include different people.
And how would you, which tip would you give to teachers dealing with the neurotypical students on how to raise awareness and tolerance, and how to make the other students realize that it's also their responsibility to include the neuroatypical students?
Projects, have them engaged in projects, have them call blind, deaf, autistic, have them call these people in, have them interact with them in projects. It's awesome. You get really interesting results.
Amazing, amazing. And I actually liked very much that idea of blindfolding students while the blind one was delivering a speech, because it makes everybody feel a little bit the taste of how it feels, what it's really like.
They were complaining that this student was very slow and he didn't read everything he should have read. I said, okay, so A reads text A for him, B reads text B for him, C, and then everybody just goes, whoa. They knew that it was time consuming.
Yeah. All right. And then we also have a question from Gladys. Miriam, would you say that visually impaired students tend to be more aware and autonomous than other students with special learning needs?
It depends if the student has comorbidities, if he has other diseases associated with blindness. For instance, we had a student, she was autistic. No, there were 2 who were autistic, schizophrenic. And this lady who was blind and schizophrenic would take 2 imaginary children with her to school. So my sighted students and I had to learn with her to leave 2 chairs for her imaginary children. And when we had parties like Halloween, we would even put candy and special treats for her imaginary kids. She wouldn't get, otherwise she would get very nervous. So we had to respect her imaginary characters. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Teacher Rico de Oliveira is asking, dear Miriam, can you share with us your book titles again, please?
Oh, yes. And they're free, okay?
Amazing.
Except for the evaluation, the English.
All right. Can you share your screen again?
Yes. If you write teaching English to visually impaired Retorta, you'll come to this one. And they've got lots of hints. It's action oriented, right? This is the ebook, the audiobook, I'm sorry. This is the audiobook. It's really audiolingual. We had to go back in time because blind students ask you to spell things all the time. And they ask you to repeat things all over and over again. So my students and I decided to go back to the audiolingual era. and have an audiobook for them. And they would listen to this until they get, memorized word by word. And it's interesting, most of them became fluent in the English language. This is free, and this is free. This is free for teachers. It's also good for sighted students. We found out that it works for blind, but it works for sighted students as well. And this one is a good book for prática de ensino, metodologia de ensino, because it gives you good tips on how to evaluate. But it's not expensive. I guess it's yeah.
Amazing. Let me see. I see my context that most of children enjoy helping the disabled classmates. Sometimes they would remember me, the medication time, what the classmates trying to tell me, and etc.
Exactly. And if you put everybody to help, even the mean ones, they identify themselves with the disabled and they start helping.
Yeah. Yeah, they take on the role not only of facilitators, but also of caretakers sometimes.
And responsible for
yes,
the process.
Yes, it helps them to be more autonomous as learners, and also more responsible in many layers.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And everything that Professor Judith said about accommodation and format, presentation, response, timing, so true, so true. It makes so much sense, really interesting.
There is a comment from Evila. Dear Professor Retorta, thank you for your excellent presentation. It brought important insights for me as I work in an inclusive program in the institution where I work. Although we don't have any student with visual impairment in our program, this research will contribute for our work and preparation to receive students with this disability. All right. Gladys and Alberto, they have shared the link to the books as well.
Oh, thank you.
And I would like to ask you, please, go on.
One thing about evaluation, and we learned that with the blind students, we gave them a fill in the blank activity, and the students who didn't know how to use screen readers were taught how to read screen readers. We learned first with the blind students who knew how to use them, and then we taught the ones who didn't know how. And we found out that with fill in the blanks, for example, the screen reader would read and it would skip the blank. It wouldn't read the blank. So it's impossible for a visually impaired person to use a screen reader to take fill in the blanks. So we had to adapt. And what one blind student says, teacher, in the blank, write the word blank, because the screen reader will read the word blank, and we will know that there is a missing word there. So the same thing happened with multiple choice. The screen reader reads multiple choice at once, like nonstop. So you don't know what is alternative A, alternative B, alternative C. So we had to adapt all the multiple choices for them, writing alternative 1, alternative 2, so they could go over and listen over and over again and choose the correct alternative. So it was very interesting. The interaction amongst my undergraduate students and blind students was very, very important, because then we knew what worked in terms of evaluation and what did not work, and how we adapted their material to this public, to this specific group.
Amazing. And I would like to ask your thoughts on our current Brazilian legislation on dealing with students with special disabilities. You've mentioned it. In your opinion, it was well written and etc. But do you see anything, any margin for improvement?
The documents have been very well conceived and written. They're excellent. The problem is at university. They're not taught. They're not read at university. They have to be not only read, discussed, debated. You see? So we have wonderful, and they have to be respected. Laws have to be respected in this country. For example, there is a law that disabled students are entitled to tutors or assistants, as you said, but only if you go to court and ask and sue the school to make the school get you an assistant.
I've seen this so many times.
You
I've
see?
seen this many, many, many times.
So the law is perfect. The legislation is well written, awesome. It just needs to be respected, known by everybody, and respected by everybody.
All right.
The problem is the person behind the person reading the legislation.
Actually putting it into practice, right?
Mm-hmm. And a lot of these you have to call these students or these people to talk about their disabilities, because no neurotypic person, even researchers, know how they feel. And it's very interesting to listen to their side. We had a debate with 6 blind women, all my age, talking about them being blind women in Brazil. And it was really interesting to listen to what they had to say. Another problem. No, no, but it would be awesome to have them talk again. It's really interesting. Let me give you another example. We took these students to the museum. Some of them had never gone to the museum. So we asked the organizer if they could touch the sculptures and the como é que era? Era João Torim sculptures. And they were permitted to touch. And there was a big painting with wreaths, and they were, one of the ladies my age, touching. And I said, well, this is a bow and an arrow. I says, oh, okay, I want to see what a bow and arrow is. Explain this to me. So I held her hand and I described what an arrow was. I described what a bow was. I described how you use it, how the Indian was using it. After I finished, she says, oh, now I know what a bow and arrow is. So how can you ask a student, like the student is reading something and the word bow and arrow comes up, and the blind student has no idea. The blind student has no symbolic representation of what a bow and an arrow is. So how can you ask a student to read, or how can that be included in an evaluative assignment if the student doesn't know what it is? You can't take for granted that they know what it is.
Yeah, because they only build their repertoire of semantical meanings by experiencing the words, usually through sight. So if they have never seen, they only heard about something, but how to make sure that they actually understand what those words mean actually.
Exactly. We were teaching food and beverages to these blind students, and we said pickles, and one student says, what are pickles? And we described, he says, I never taste pickles. So next class we took pickles for him to taste. So you see, it wouldn't come to our thought that these people didn't have symbolic representation of a lot of things that we take for granted.
That's amazing, especially for English teachers. Teaching English in Brazil, English is a second language, foreign language, additional language, because we rely a lot on images and visual aids in general to help building a student's vocabulary. What if we just can't? What if this is not an available resource? How would this teacher cope with this situation? Interesting. Food for thought. Very, very interesting. I have another question for you. You mentioned the ENEM, the Brazilian SAT exam. Do you know the situation in other big exams like university entrance exams, like vestibulares, public tests for concursos públicos, you know, or even state evaluations, state assessments, like we have here in São Paulo, SARESP, and state evaluations in general?
Yes. Unfortunately, none of them allow screen readers. I know there is a question of cheating, but they're blind, so you can have an assistant next to the person. You can turn off the Wi-Fi or whatever you have to do in order for it to be clean. But none, zero, none of them allow the student to take his or her laptop, which is very sad, because for a blind student, screen reader is everything. And for a blind student, an iPhone is the best thing ever. A student can do everything with an iPhone, everything. He can write, he can read, he can send his teacher the assignments, everything. And unfortunately, they say that they will be cheating, right? And that this can be discussed and solved.
Easily, if we had an invigilator, just a person invigilating the exam would be there. The person there from the institution, from the university, or anyways, the organization behind the test, just making sure that was not a malpractice in any kind.
Just cut the Wi-Fi in the room where they are, and that's it.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we don't make these kinds of tests and assessments available for blind students. That's a pity.
And the reader in ENEM, you should, I mean, I know there are people who read English well, but if only 5% of Brazilians speak English, at least to B2, 5% of our population, can you imagine what kind of reading these people, they do the best they can. They're volunteers. I know they're doing their best, but it's not fair for a blind student to take an examination, to have a reader read out loud, and being his English not as good or not good enough for him. And plus it's a listening test, which is not taught in Brazil.
Yeah,
there are many problems to solve.
Yeah, there's another layer of intricacy that we have to pay attention, which is the proficiency level of this reader. So how well does this reader speak English to be able to read appropriately with a minimum level of accuracy, pronunciation, and etc., intonation. So this blind student is able to understand, listen, understand, and answer the questions properly.
Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about blind now, talking about autistic, for example. I had an autistic student in my classroom in the undergraduate course. He would sit alone at the end of the room. He wouldn't interact with anybody. Suddenly he would just get up and run away from the class. And I said, there must be something wrong with this fellow. And the next day I talked to the person, says, do you have any kind of disability? He says, yeah, I'm autistic. So why didn't you tell us? Because most professors thought that he was having a bad behavior. He was a negative student, you know, being negative. And it says, no, he's not, he's autistic. You have to let him run away when he needs to run away. He'll come back. And eventually I talked to my colleagues and says, listen, this person is autistic. If he runs out, he's not doing this intentionally. He'll be back, blah, 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 blah. You know, how do you do group work with an autistic person? And we have a lot of group work. So these things have to be negotiated, you know, among the colleagues, among classmates. All these questions, you know, have to be addressed.
Yeah, Anna has just posted in the chat box all the licenciatura courses, which are the teacher certificates in Brazil. For people abroad, the teaching certificates in Brazil should be prepared teachers to deal with that, or at least give them a view on how to work with students. I understand we need to face this different scenarios, but we as teachers need help too. How do you see the current status of our initial teaching qualification courses, the initial courses like licenciaturas in Brazil regarding dealing with students with special needs?
Instead of having a discipline, a formal discipline, I think we need to take our undergraduate students to Instituto Paranaense dos Cegos, Instituto dos Cegos. We need to take our students or bring these students over for projects to teach them math, English, whatever. And our undergraduate students will learn with these students. They will be helping them learn something new, right? Either English or math or whatever. And they will be learning with them how to deal with it. It's not a question of having a discipline and studying the discipline. You have to put your hands in it. It has to be hands-on. You have to learn with them.
All right. And for some of us here who have never had the experience of dealing with a blind student, for example, how do you think that we could be better prepared for when time comes we have a student with this kind of disability?
Start volunteering in different places.
Interesting.
Right? One of my teenage blind student, 17-year-old guy, he said he had never gone to clubbing and he would love to go clubbing. And so I asked my undergraduate students, I said, hey, who is going to take him clubbing? And eventually they did take him clubbing. So it's interacting with them. It's volunteering. It's writing projects at university and have them come in, or you go where they are, or either they come to your university and do things with them. You learn with them. Without them, you cannot learn. No books. It's with them. It's every day, every day, every day, and you learn with them a lot. I've learned a lot with them, a lot.
All right. And do you have any tips on institutions where our attendees could volunteer for?
Oh, yeah. Almost every city has the Instituto de Cegos, blind, right? And they have other institutions for other disabilities. And I really suggest that you 6 months here, 6 months there, have projects, cursos de extensão, extension projects. That's essential in any university. How can you do research without doing extension programs? How can you collect data? How can you know what's going on? So that would be the best thing for all of them. All my undergraduate students who have been involved in this project, blind project with me, they feel comfortable now dealing with blind people.
All right. And how was your very first experience dealing with blind people? When was it, and how was it?
Yeah, this blind director from ADEVIPAR, Associação dos Deficientes Visuais do Paraná, came to me and he says, nobody knows how to teach English to us. can your university teach us? It says, well, I've never taught anybody blind, but we could try, yeah. So we started this project because he had asked us, and it was the first time, and we learned a lot of things. It's not only about teaching, it's about interacting with people who are different. And it's awesome. It's awesome. They are happy. They put you up all the time. They are very grateful. When they started speaking English and they start speaking English to American, blind American, they go crazy. Says, I'm speaking English to somebody else, you know. So it's fun to see them evolve.
All right. So Miriam, I would like to thank you very much on behalf
You're
of São
welcome.
Paulo Bay Center. Thank you for attending and presenting in our event. Our chat box is surely filled with lots of people thanking you for bringing different insights. And thank you very much. We are going to see you in a few minutes in the discussion panel. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure. So now we're going to go on a very short break as well. We're going to come back at 11:25 Brazilian time, so in around 9 minutes. But we're going to come back in another link. I'm posting in the chat box the second link, just in case, but you also have the link for the second session of the morning, our roundtable discussion panel, in your email, the email with all the 4 links of the day. So thank you very much, and we're going to be with you there very, very, very soon. Okay, thank you very much. See you there in a couple of minutes.